On Remembrance Day, why do we not remember 2M plus dead victims of the Bengal famine, the largest man-made humanitarian crisis created by Winston Churchill? You can remember whatever you like on Remembrance Day. Officially, the day is for remembrance of all victims of conflict worldwide, though it started out in remembrance of the fallen of the First World War, so nothing to do with WW2 or any other events in the 40s, which is why it is still held on the Sunday closest to the anniversary of the ending of WW1. It's expanded in scope since then after the war to end all wars turned out to only be the opening salvos of a century of conflict. But if you're feeling incensed that the day is about honoring Winston Churchill and ignores victims of some of his other actions, then it's not that at all, and anyone using it as some kind of commemoration of national triumph is missing the point completely. Obviously, the Bengal famine was an enormous tragedy which people haven't enough awareness of and is worth remembering. But if you're implying that by not specifically referencing it on a day set aside to remember the terrible cost of war, that had already been observed for 20 years before World War II broke out, people are deliberately ignoring it, then you're wrong. Because it was not man-made and it was not created by Winston Churchill. In fact, without Churchill the death toll would have been even higher. Dr. Shashi Tharoor blamed Churchill for the famine in his book, and now this myth has gone across India. First, the famine was 1943, only 3 years after Churchill became Prime Minister. For such a deliberate policy as this, it would have taken years to plan. The fact is, the famine was caused by a multitude of events, natural causes, the pressure of war and bad management both from the British and Indians. There was no deliberate famine, which would have been a lot worse without Churchill. He managed to find enough ships to transport 350,000 tons of grain from Australia to Bengal and helped set up the Famine Commission. I hate Indians. They are a beastly people with a beastly religion. The famine was their own fault for breeding like rabbits. That is hardly proof that he caused the famine. People say stuff like that every day. The Churchill Project of Hillsdale College has this to say. Though administrative failures were immediately responsible for this human suffering, the principal cause of the short crop supply in 1943 was the epidemic of brown spot disease which attacked the rice crop in Bengal in 1942. Nothing as devastating as the Bengal rice brown spot epidemic of 1942 has been recorded in plant pathology literature. The disease caused yield reductions of rice in Bengal of 40 to 90%. As good as his word, and despite preoccupation with the upcoming invasion of France, Churchill wrote American President Franklin Delano Roosevelt FDR. No one, reading his words, can be in doubt about his sympathies. I am seriously concerned about the food situation in India. Last year we had a grievous famine in Bengal through which at least 700,000 people died. This year there is a good crop of rice, but we are faced with an acute shortage of wheat, aggravated by unprecedented cutting down military shipments and other means. I have been able to arrange for 350,000 tons of wheat to be shipped to India from Australia during the first 9 months of 1944. This is the shortest haul. I cannot see how to do more. Winston Churchill has been blamed for causing the Bengal famine by many Indians. However, these accusations have no basis with reality. Churchill did everything he could to help the starving of Bengal. I have had much hesitation in asking you to add to the great assistance you are giving us with shipping, but a satisfactory situation in India is of such vital importance to the success of our joint plans against the Japanese that I am impelled to ask you to consider a special allocation of ships to carry wheat to India from Australia. We have the wheat in Australia, but we lack the ships. I have resisted for some time the Viceroy's request that I should ask you for your help, but I am no longer justified in not asking for your help. 20. A month later, Churchill was hoping India had turned the corner when his Minister of War Transport, Frederick Leathers, reported statistically a surplus of food grains in India. Still, Leathers emphasized the need for imported wheat on psychological grounds. What were they? Ameri explained that the peasant in 750,000 villages might hold back his small parcel of grain if no outside aid was in sight. He said he could ship 200,000 tons, provided that the 25 ships required was surplus to the army's needs. But Ameri wanted double that quantity. 16. Again trying to help, the cabinet suggested that India had underestimated its rice crop. While agreeing to send the 200,000 tons, Churchill told Ameri he could get another 150,000 tons from Ceylon in exchange for excess rice. The net effect, counting 50,000 tons previously arranged, was 400,000 tons of wheat. In April, it was Lord Wavell asking not for 400,000 but 724,000 tons. Now the problem was unseasonable weather and a deadly explosion in the Bombay docks, which destroyed 50,000 tons of food grains. Peasants were still holding back their crops, he said. Rumors were circulating that London had refused to ask America for help. The exasperated cabinet retorted, if we now approached the United States and they were unable to help, it would at least dispel that allegation. One can sense Churchill's frustration. Whatever they did, however they wriggled, they could not appease the continued demands from India, even after calculations showed that the shortage had been eased. Churchill agreed to write President Roosevelt for help, and replace the 45,000 tons lost in the explosion. But he could only provide further relief for the Indian situation at the cost of incurring grave difficulties in other directions. 19. The outbreak of brown spot that afflicted the rice crop of late 1942 was exceptionally virulent. None of the 15 winter varieties grown in these two stations, which were hundreds of miles apart, demonstrated any capacity to resist the disease. Yields fell often to 1/10 of the previous year's more or less normal level. The article also presented meteorological evidence showing that weather conditions in 1942 were unusually uniform and favorable for the spread of the disease all over Bengal, as well as scientific tests indicating that weather conditions disseminated spores of the disease widely in Bengal in late 1942. As a result, plant biologists hold that there was indeed a significant shortage of rice in 1943. Brown spot disease that attacks rice and other grass-like plants was the major cause for the Bengal famine. Data from S.Y. Padmanabhan, director of the Central Rice Research Institute in Cuttack, India shows the outbreak of brown spot that afflicted the rice crop of late 1942 was exceptionally virulent. None of the 15 winter varieties grown in these two stations, which were hundreds of miles apart, demonstrated any capacity to resist the disease. Yields fell often to 1/10 of the previous year's more or less normal level. The article also presented meteorological evidence showing that weather conditions in 1942 were unusually uniform and favorable for the spread of the disease all over Bengal, as well as scientific tests indicating that weather conditions disseminated spores of the disease widely in Bengal in late 1942. As a result, plant biologists hold that there was indeed a significant shortage of rice in 1943. S.Y. Padmanabhan, director of the Central Rice Research Institute and one of the world's top rice growing experts. He found that brown spot disease was the chief cause for the Bengal famine. Bengal, which prior to the partition of India covered the state of West Bengal in India and Bangladesh, suffered from a calamitous famine in 1943, when 2 million people died of starvation. Altogether, about 3 million people may have died as a result of the famine as disease killed those weakened by starvation. The deaths occurred among the rural population who could not afford to buy rice, which had increased significantly in price due to short supply. World War II had cut off imports of rice from Burma. Shipments of food from Britain, Canada, and the USA were limited due to wartime priorities elsewhere. Food administration in India was the responsibility of provincial governments. Provinces, like Punjab, where food was not in short supply, prohibited rice exports to other regions. The Bengal government made the feeding of the urban Calcutta population a priority and requisitioned rice supplies from rural areas. Many people migrated to the cities in the hope of finding employment and rise. Finding neither, they slowly died of starvation. Though administrative failures were immediately responsible for this human suffering, the principal cause of the short crop supply in 1943 was the epidemic of brown spot disease which attacked the rice crop in Bengal in 1942. Nothing as devastating as the Bengal rice brown spot epidemic of 1942 has been recorded in plant pathology literature. The disease caused yield reductions of rice in Bengal of 40 to 90%. Brown spot is caused by a fungus that infects rice plants, killing large areas of affected leaves. Brown spot reduces the number of grains per panicle and the kernel weight. Climatic factors that were correlated with the brown spot epidemic in Bengal in 1942 were above normal rainfall, high humidity, prolonged periods of cloudy weather, and warmer than average temperatures during the flowering and grain filling stages. These weather conditions were very unusual. Rather than ending in late August or early September, an additional 15 to 25 inches of rain fell through November, causing the massive release of disease spores at the exact time that rice plants were most susceptible to infection. The incidence of brown spot on rice in India has increased in recent years. High levels of genetic resistance have not been observed against brown spot. Use of fungicides as the main method to control brown spot outbreaks. Early synthetic chemical fungicides did not provide satisfactory control of brown spot and were not recommended. However, recent research has demonstrated that new fungicide formulations provide effective control, reducing brown spot incidence by 90% and preventing yield loss of 30%. Because Remembrance Day honors the brave souls who died in the Great War. If you want to petition the government where you live to create a Bengali famine Remembrance Day, please do so. The backhanded swipe you are taking at Winston Churchill in your question is not lost on me. Please do yourself a favor and research the causes of the Bengali famine with an open and unbiased mind, applying every critical thinking skill in your mental arsenal while doing so. Above all, be fair in your judgment of the facts. I think you will find that Mr. Churchill was not the bogeyman that he was made out to. Why did the British people support Winston Churchill despite his views on race, colonialist attitudes, alleged complicity in Allied war crimes and the Bengali famine? Was Churchill largely responsible for the Bengal famine of 1943? Why does no one talk about the atrocities of Churchill when he caused the Bengal famine that killed 4 million people? Why was Winston Churchill so fat? The fact that he drank a lot, especially champagne, probably contributed heavily. He also overate frequently, probably due to stress, and British food at the time, especially the sort of food he had access to, was very high in fat and carbs. He wasn't particularly active. His job not only required him to sit at a desk, it also took up enough of his time and attention that he probably didn't devote much of his free time to sport or athletics. Also, at the time we remember him, he was fairly old, and as you age, your metabolism slows down. He acted like a thinking man, ate like a working man, and Did Winston Churchill resign? Yes, because of his health and age. When he became Prime Minister for a second time, he was 77 years old and not in great health. Throughout his second term, Churchill had numerous health hurdles, including at least 2 strokes. His eventual and designated successor, Anthony Eden, was also suffering from health problems. Eden was suffering from a botched surgery, and that helped aid in Churchill's delay of resignation. Churchill didn't want to resign and there be a PM in even worse shape than him. Eventually Eden recovered, regained his vitality, and Churchill had suffered from a at least 3rd stroke. Was Winston Churchill a good man? First you have to define good. Churchill was a borderline alcoholic. He was clinically depressed and often spoke of his black dog on his shoulder. He was a product of an unloving mother and a father who suffered from syphilis and eventually went mad. He was sent to Harrow as a boarder but hardly ever had visits from his parents. He struggled at school because he was dyslexic. When he left school, he got a job as a journalist and went to South Africa to report on the Second Boer War. Whilst there, the train he was riding in was ambushed. He took command of the defense but was captured and imprisoned. Was Winston Churchill an arrogant man? Churchill's personality was complex. He performed poorly in school and barely made it into Sandhurst. Some of his teachers sensed his potential, particularly in history and writing, but he was weak in foreign languages and math. His rise to prominence had mostly to do with his instinctive understanding of self-promotion. He made sure, as a young, well-connected officer and correspondent, to be where the action was. And he saw to it that his exploits were promptly announced to the world by his publishers. His entry into politics placed him where he could put his verbal and self-promotional tale. What made Winston Churchill an effective orator? Churchill tells us in an unpublished essay called The Scaffolding of Rhetoric. Churchill's extraordinary speeches hinged on a series of classical rhetorical devices. In an essay entitled The Scaffolding of Rhetoric, he described their use as the subtle art of combining the various elements that separately mean nothing and collectively mean so much in an harmonious proportion as known to a very few. Here are a few of his most famous flourishes. Anaphora. The repetition of words or phrases at the start of a succession of clauses. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing. Was Winston Churchill a strong man? In his younger days, certainly. He was a keen rider and sportsman. One contemporary described him on the polo fields as neither deft nor graceful, but full of tearing physical energy. Furthermore, he took up bricklaying as a somewhat bizarre hobby, and constructed walls and houses with his own hands. That requires a great deal of strength and stamina. By the time he became Prime Minister, however, he was old, overweight, and no longer in his physical prime, though still very energetic for someone of his age. Was Winston Churchill bad? Some say he was a warmonger, a tyrant, and a mass murderer. So what is the truth? Churchill was a complex figure. He did good things and he did bad things. Neither washes away the other, and they have to be seen in the context of the world at the time. Until the late 30s and the start of World War II, Churchill's career was not very impressive, and if he died before that time, he would be remembered as a particularly pompous conservative toady with dubious military competence. During World War I, he was one of the people who oversaw the disastrous Gallipoli expedition. He had opposed female suffrage until reluctantly trying to co-opt it later on and failing to pass it because of his P. What do British people think of Winston Churchill? Opinion is divided. Extremely divided, in fact. Look at the other answers written by various Britons. Like FDR and Teddy Roosevelt, he's too big to judge. His flaws were open and glaring. His merits were outstanding. Neither worshipping him as a hero, nor demonizing him as a villain, can properly take the measure of the man. I think, for all his faults, he was the right man at the right time. And when that time had passed, the public replaced him. He was a great leader of the United Kingdom when it was facing danger. When the danger was past and it was time to rebuild, another style of leader was Winston Churchill American? Churchill was the epitome of an Englishman. I do understand the desire for him to be the son of many fathers, after all, who doesn't like a success? However, he was one of the many great people born of England. During the Bengal famine, how many lives lost can be attributed to Churchill's actions and how many to factors out of anyone's control? I think you have missed out, maybe because of forgetfulness, a major, perhaps the major, cause of the Bengal famine. A renegade Indian national, Subhash Chandra Bose, had raised a revolutionary Indian army and allied himself and his followers with the Japanese, attempting to invade India from Myanmar by both northerly and southern routes. The northerly invasion was stopped by the epic battle known as Imphal Kohima, in which the Imperial Japanese Army suffered its only major defeat in a set-piece battle, as opposed to losing strings of small oceanic islands. At the same time as the attempted push-I. Did Winston Churchill ever say anything about the Bengal famine? Yes. Peace, order and a high condition of wartime well-being among the masses of the people constitute the essential foundation of the forward thrust against the enemy. The hard pressures of World War have for the first time for many years brought conditions of scarcity, verging in some localities into actual famine, upon India. Every effort must be made, even by the diversion of shipping urgently needed for war purposes, to deal with local shortages. Every effort should be made by you to assuage the strife between the Hindus and Muslims and to induce them to work together for the common good. Why did the British people support Winston Churchill despite his views on race, colonialist attitudes, alleged complicity in Allied war crimes and the Bengali famine? Was Churchill largely responsible for the Bengal famine of 1943? Why does no one talk about the atrocities of Churchill when he caused the Bengal famine that killed 4 million people? How come Winston Churchill is considered as a hero despite the fact that millions of Indians died during the Bengal famine, a consequence of British policy and disregard for Indians, while Hitler is considered a close devil for also killing millions? Why is Winston Churchill respected by the world as a good leader despite being a racist and being responsible for the 1943 Bengal famine that killed 4 million people? Was Churchill and Britain at large really to blame for the Bengal famine? To me, it doesn't seem fair to place the full blame on the UK and Churchill, and some go as far to call it a genocide. Is that true? Why are Winston Churchill's atrocities towards the Bengali people, like the Bengal famine, ignored? Why don't British people hold Sir Robert Peel responsible for the Great Irish Famine 1840s, or Sir Winston Churchill for the Bengal Famine 1940s? Is it because British people have a tendency to hide the misdoings of their leaders? Was the Bengal famine of 1943 estimated to have killed up to 3 million people was not caused by drought but instead was a result of a complete policy failure of the then British Prime Minister Winston Churchill? During the Bengal famine, how many lives lost can be attributed to Churchill's actions and how many to factors out of anyone's control? Attributing the Bengal famine solely to Winston Churchill is a misconception. The famine occurred in 1943, 3 years after Churchill became Prime Minister, making it implausible for him to have deliberately caused it. The reality is that the Bengal famine resulted from a combination of various factors, including natural causes, pressures of war, and mismanagement by both British and Indian authorities. One significant factor was the epidemic of brown spot disease that attacked the rice crop in Bengal in 1942, causing severe reductions in rice yield. Churchill's involvement in addressing the famine highlights his efforts to alleviate the crisis and provide aid during the dire circumstances. The article encourages a more nuanced understanding of historical events and the complexities that shape them.